Chapter 2. Rain blinked and shifted her weight. Whatever she was lying on was cold and hard and slightly damp beneath her fingers. She pushed herself up and looked around. A large cavern stretched out around her. It was dimly lit, but she couldn't make out the source of the light. She turned to a sound behind her, a faint shuffle, and saw that she was not alone. A tall, gracefully thin man stepped forward. He was wearing tan robes like a priest at Mass, but there was nothing else priestly about him. His features were sharp and defined, and perfect, she thought. She looked at his feet as he walked toward her. They were bare on the stone floor. He began to walk around her in a slow circle. Each step was easy and cat-like. Rain gathered herself into a crouch and stood. The man stopped in front of her and turned to meet her gaze. His hair was neither light nor with age nor blonde, but a pure and iridescent white. His eyes were black. Like holes, Rain thought. If the eyes are the windows to the soul, then this man's soul is empty. She shuddered, seeming to sense her unease. The man closed his eyes and lowered his head. When he looked out at her again, his eyes were a pure and vibrant cobalt blue. Rain swallowed. "You don't even know, do you, what you are?" He cocked his head and walked toward her. As he drew closer, he smiled. His teeth were small and sharp. He lifted a hand before Rain's face and spread his fingers. The center of his palm darkened and became a blackness that spread outward, swallowing the air around it. Rain opened her eyes. She lay in bed covered with the thick, cold sweat of nightmares. She couldn't seem to shake the image of those bottomless eyes, or the spreading darkness from her mind. She wiped her face with her shirt and looked at the clock on her nightstand. Cool green numbers proclaimed that it was 5:55. The triple digits seemed to thrum with significance. Her alarm hadn't sounded, yet she turned it off. The sky outside had just begun to blush with pre-dawn glow. Pushing herself up out of bed, she staggered to the bathroom down the hall, bumping into the wall as she rubbed her eyes. She stripped her sweat-soaked clothes from her body in a stupor and turned on the shower. A chill ran over her bare, damp skin as she turned up the hot water. The steaming rain of the shower hit her skin. Her mind began to work again, and she sighed, leaning back to let the water run down her face and head. Her dark, shoulder-length hair clung to her neck as rivulets trailed from the ends, following the curves of her back and shoulders. As she turned off the water, she grabbed a towel from the rack on the door and dried herself. The towel felt good on her skin. Her calves were itchy from the heat of the water, and she rubbed them forcefully. The mirror was fogged, and she wiped a hand across it, clearing a patch. She took a hair tie from the cabinet and pulled her hair into a messy ponytail. When she'd dressed, she hunted for her keys, found them in the couch cushions, and headed out to Roger, her blue Toyota. She'd always figured if men could name their sports cars and muscle cars after women, she could name hers after a man, and had done so after Roger Waters. She'd found a large Suncatcher sticker of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album cover and had stuck it in the bottom center of the rear window. Route 40 had the usual morning traffic, which wasn't bad compared to some roads. She'd driven a number of times around Baltimore and had made the horrible mistake of traveling the loop at 8 in the morning. Once she left the highway, the roads were nearly empty as she drove past the local airport toward Schenck Brothers' greenhouse. As she pulled into the parking lot, she saw that Ken Schenck was already there. His green pickup with its distinctive orange passenger door was parked next to an old red barn at the front of the property. Ken's brother, Gerald, lived in a house across the street, just at the edge of the airport's property line, so that his home was beneath a constant stream of rising airplanes. He said that first week he lived there, he hardly slept at all, but that now, any time he tried to sleep anywhere else, he couldn't because it was too quiet. Rain pulled up next to Ken's pickup and walked to the small greenhouse by the front office. She clocked in, punching her manila time card in an ancient green time clock on the wall. The air in the small greenhouse was cooler and drier than the ones she worked in. It smelled of moss and greenery, and Rain often wandered among the rows of plants. Houseplants of varied exotic origins were kept there. A massive elkhorn fern hung from the beams, more for show than for sale. It had been a mascot of the greenhouse for years. Touch-me-not plants folded their fronds as she brushed past them on her way out the door. She crossed the gravel drive, passing the great red barn on her way to the other greenhouses. 3 of them, connected to one another by open arched doorways, stood behind a cornfield. Within them were housed the outdoor plants that the Schenck brothers provided for various landscaping companies. Huge fans sucked air in one end and blew it out the other to keep the temperature in the greenhouses tolerable, but even with the fans, the heat rose easily to the upper 90s in the summer. There were only 4 employees at Schenck brothers' greenhouses, aside from Rain. Plants required little manpower to maintain, and she usually had the big greenhouses to herself. The air was humid and heavy, and she began the long process of watering the plants in each of the 3 massive greenhouses. Thousands of plants, each one thirsty and waiting, were lined up before her. The rows of flats, covered with multicolored blooms, looked like a lush and magical carpet. Row by row and flat by flat she watered them. The hose stretched from the overhead water pipes as she made her way from the first greenhouse to the last. She tried to concentrate on the green leaves, the colorful flowers, the sound of the water, and the roar of the jets as they lifted from the runway outside, but her mind kept wandering to the previous night's events. "Rain's raining, I see." She turned to see the delivery man by the door of the greenhouse. He took down a brown clipboard. A pen was tied to it with a string. "Hi, Peter," she waved with her free hand. Every time he came to get the clipboard, if she was watering the plants, he made the same joke. No matter how many times she heard it, it never got any funnier. But he was nice, and she didn't want to be rude, so she smiled and chuckled when he made it. He scribbled on the clipboard, hung it back up, and headed out the door. "Bye, Rain," he said, waving. She waved back, not saying anything. When she looked at her watch, it was almost noon. Stowing the sprayer, she walked to the barn. Its great doors stood open on both sides, making a breezeway. She wiped her brow and splashed cold water on her face from a spigot just inside the door. Gerald Schenck was leaning against the ladder that led to the hayloft. The only thing that wasn't kept in the hayloft was hay. Shovels, bags of dirt and mulch, extra flats, and lengths of replacement hose were stashed about in unorganized piles among the steel barrels, unmarked crates and boxes, and an assortment of other various items, including a blue scuffed-up canoe and 2 oars, one of which was broken. "Hey, Rain." Gerald nodded to her and took an enormous bite from what looked like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. A blob of strawberry jelly clung to his overly large mustache. You've got a little something in the soup strainer," she said, and pointed to her own upper lip. Gerald shrugged, took 2 more bites in close succession so that his cheeks puffed out like a squirrel. He stopped chewing long enough to give her a wide, puffy, close-lipped grin. The laughed lines around his eyes deepened. "We have a load of mums that just came in that need to be de-headed," voice behind her, and she turned around. Ken was drying his hands on his pants as he walked into the makeshift break room in the front corner of the breezeway. It had been outfitted with a water cooler, which was seldom used. They usually drank from the spigot by the barn door. The water was always colder, and Rain sometimes wondered if the water in the cooler had ever been changed. She shuddered to think of how long it might have been there. The break room also had a small, ancient brown refrigerator, a grimy, beat-up microwave with a dial setting, and a coffee maker which had at some point in its life been white. Ken walked up to the coffee maker and picked up the pot, peering at its contents. The coffee in it looked like it had been brewed the previous day, and it wasn't unusual for whoever arrived first to simply turn the coffee maker on and reheat whatever was left. As long as nothing was floating in it, it was considered fine. This was what Gerald referred to as the Schenck brothers' famous patented espresso, or as Ken called it, greenhouse mud. He poured himself a cup, sniffed it, and downed most of the cup in one gulp. Rain watched him as she took her lunch from the refrigerator. "Rough night, Ken?" He rolled his eyes. "Bobby had us up till 3. Bobby was Ken's 10-month-old son. He and his wife Barbara had been trying for almost 3 years to have a baby, and Rain wondered sometimes if they were now having second thoughts about how wonderful it was going to be. He wouldn't eat, he wouldn't sleep, he just cried and cried. Finally, we put him in his crib and went out on the front porch. Barb brought the baby monitor along, but we could hear him through the closed upstairs window without it anyway. I guess he's been teething or something. We tried that teething gel that Barb's mom suggested, but he just seemed to cry harder if we used it." Ken poured another cup of greenhouse mud and sat down at the little folding card table in the corner. Gerald chuckled from his seat on the ladder and looked at his brother. "Really, thank you for reminding me why I don't mind being a bachelor. He had finally managed to remove the jelly from his mustache and wadded up a paper towel, throwing it across the breezeway into the trash can by the break room door. Ken shot Gerald a look that Rain was glad she'd never been on the receiving end of. "I wouldn't trade it for anything. Sleep or no sleep," he said, and smiled. Gerald was the older of the two, that much was obvious, but they were brothers, and that was harder to see. Where Gerald had square, masculine features, Ken's were rounder and soft. Ken had blonde, straight hair and tended to wear khakis every day of the year. Gerald had coarse, wavy, dark brown hair and leaned more toward the lumberjack school of fashion. Rain had often wondered how many plaid shirts one man could possibly own. Their personalities, too, were polar opposites. Ken was meticulous, punctual, and serious more often than not. Gerald was easygoing and the jokester of the greenhouse. He seemed to get a kick out of his ability to either gross people out or annoy them, as much as make them laugh, and went out of his way to do all three. Rain took her lunch, a leftover burrito and an apple, and sat on a steel drum against the opposite wall of the breezeway. Overhead a jet roared through the air. She took a bite of burrito and looked over at Gerald. "I think I have a stalker," she said. "A stalker? Why do you think that?" He put down his soda. Rain told him about her nightly visitor. "So you did call the cops?" Ken asked from the break room. "Yeah, last night. They sent someone out, but the guy had disappeared. One second he was standing by the patio, the next he was nowhere." "Well," said a young man by the barn door. He had messy black hair and country boy good looks. "If he comes back tonight, call me. I'll come show him what's what." He walked into the barn, heels of his cowboy boots scuffing against the concrete. "Thanks, Rhett. I think I'll be fine. It's weird, though. I can't think of why he'd be showing up. I don't recognize him at all." She was curious to see what the others would say. "Well, it sounds like you did the right thing," said Ken. "If he shows up again, call the cops right away, okay?" Ken stood and walked out of the breezeway. "Okay, Rain?" Rain looked down at her apple. "Okay, I will," she lied. She didn't know if she would or not. Gerald walked out of the barn, and Ken followed, taking the last dregs of greenhouse mud with him. Rhett leaned against the wall by Rain's perch atop the drum. "Seriously, Rain, if you see him again, call me." He looked at the rafters of the barn and crossed one foot over the other. "Heck, even if you don't see him, call me." Rain sighed. "Rhett, I keep telling you, I don't date co-workers. It's never a good idea." "Right, because teasing them is so much more fun. Listen, if you're not interested, just say so." He shrugged. "I don't tease you, and I didn't say I wasn't interested." "Then you are interested." He looked at her. "I didn't say that either." Rain hopped down from the drum. "You never give up, do you?" She threw away her burrito wrapper and took a bite of her apple. "What can I say? Persistence pays off in my experience." Rhett walked up to her and grabbed the apple from her hand. He took a large bite and handed it back. Rain looked from the apple to him and back again, pursing her lips. She handed him the apple. He smiled. "Hey, thanks for the apple," he said, and walked out. Rain finished watering the plants before she helped Ken, Gerald, and Rhett move the shipment of mums to the back end of the first three connected greenhouses. "The ones on this side need to be deheaded all around, and this side just needs the centers done." Ken pointed down the steel mesh shelves toward the rows of green mums. The buds were tiny, branching out from the ends of the plants. "We'll start them on Monday," said Gerald. "You two can work together. I'll let you flip for who gets which job." He gestured to Rain and Rhett. Rhett smiled, arching his eyebrows at her. "Great," Rain said, and looked at her watch. "Well, guys, it's about the time. Have a good one." She walked out the door and across the gravel parking lot. Rhett walked up beside her. "You want to stop at the latch string later tonight?" he said. "Maybe around 9? "Rhett," she started, but he put a hand on her arm and they stopped. "Just as friends, I promise. You're a cool chick. I like you. You're fun and interesting and pretty, but I can overlook all that. Come on. Just hang out for a while. I guarantee you won't regret it." Rain looked at him. He was a nice guy, and they got along well. If they weren't working together, she'd probably be interested in starting something, but they did work together. "Okay," she sighed and looked at the sky. "Okay, I'll come by, but only as friends, okay?" She poked at his chest and smiled. "Okay," he nodded his head. "Okay," and he turned and walked away, still smiling. Rain licked her lips and tasted the dried salt of her own sweat. She looked up at a jet passing overhead, the rush of the engines temporarily drowning out everything else. It would be several hours before sunset. She wondered if the man in her garden would appear again, and what she would do if he did. What if he showed up and she had to leave to meet Rhett at the latch string? Would she just walk out the front door with the mystery man standing behind her house? Should she call the police if he showed up again? Maybe she should call Rhett and cancel if the man showed up.